Yeah. Why don't we move it's just a bit to the side?
Yeah.
Because I notice otherwise I tend to look at the people on the screen and not the people in the audience.
Yeah, I can move it. Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Can I just say like a couple of
Yeah,
sentences
please. Yeah,
to
yeah.
introduce?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session on Dharma, led by Venerable Tenzin Gache. Venerable Gache was born in the USA, in the Boston area, and he graduated from Tufts University. He was ordained in 2006 in Dharamshala with His Holiness Dalai Lama. And he's here today to lead the session today and tomorrow. So welcome, Venerable. Thank you so much for offering teachings today. Over to you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. Do you have particular prayers that you usually start with? Or should I choose? How do we usually begin?
So Venerable Lectin usually does the refuge Bodhisattva prayer.
Okay, so why don't we do
Mandala also.
Okay, so why don't we do that?
This is page 34 to 37. Yeah, 34 to 35.
I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. In my practice of giving another perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. In my practice of giving another perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving another perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I can declare on my negative actions accumulated since its beginningless time, and rejoice in the merit of holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence, and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own and others' merits to those my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. Sajibugi Jugji Meino Ramri Avlinji Nidegyam Bhadi Sangye Indo Nidegu Magi Do Mala Jivayo Idam Gunamandala Gandhariyadayami. Okay, so why don't we sit quietly then for a couple minutes before we start? Okay, so we'll begin. I think this is the first time I've been here this year, maybe since last October. A bit of ways to get here, but I think I'm scheduled to come again next month. We'll do what we can. So, as I understand, you've been doing the topics of the Discovering Buddhism modules, is that right? And Venerable Egden said you've been doing karma for a little while now, all about karma. So he suggested to me that I talk about the 12 links of dependent origination, which is actually, if you were in the studying the Lamrim, it's not in the section on karma. It's separated because the section on karma is included within the path in common with the lower capable being, right? It's the meaning that it's helping you to give up attachment for this life. That's mainly what you're aiming for there. So you think about how this life doesn't last a long time. Think about death and impermanence, and you think about what would happen in the future. And you think about karma in a very coarse way, the coarse results of karma, that if I do very negative things, you talk mainly about the 10 non-virtues, then there's very heavy consequences. So wishing to avoid that. Whereas in the path on the middle capable being, then it's the goal is to have renunciation for all of samsara, not just wanting to be free of the really heady things, which is a little, it's harder, right? So the first one still requires some reflection, or really some conviction that there's a future lifetime. Although even within this one lifetime, we can see. I remember Geji Namdak, when he used to teach in the prison, he told me that he met someone who, maybe it was not just one person, I think several people who said one bad decision and then their whole life is now a lot of more suffering. So even within this lifetime that can happen, but it's a similar idea here that even as one action in our lifetime, even if we do good for most of our life, it can counteract that or overpower it. Doesn't mean the good won't also have an effect eventually, but the bad action, one bad action might be stronger. But here, within the middle capable being, we're recognizing that just that is not enough. It's not enough just to be good in this life and have a nice rebirth, because then eventually it just cycles around again. So there's two ways to look at it. One is if you're in a good rebirth, sooner or later, you'll get involved in the wrong people, maybe. Or you already have karma from the past that is waiting to ripen. And so you'll eventually fall into a very difficult rebirth. But also there's the way to look at it. Simply a good rebirth is just not desirable. If we look at the suffering of samsaras, that's what we talk about in the middle capable being with the Four Noble Truths. And even ordinary happiness really isn't happiness in the deep sense. It's tainted, you can say. So yeah, so with ordinary happiness, we can imagine there's again many ways to contemplate about this. We can think about, so we think about being born, growing up, going to school, and training in a career, having a career, finding a spouse, having a family, growing old, having children, of course, growing old, and then finally dying, if you're lucky. I mean, if you're lucky to live that long. So it might seem desirable in some degree, but what if you did that a million times? Right? Is that it might get old after a while, you could say. But if that's really, if we don't think about being free of samsara, then that's going to happen, right? It's not we're going to have one life that everything is just stable and you stay there. You have to keep cycling around and around again. So these are a lot of the reflections that you do in the middle capable being, but I won't have to talk about that so much here, just to give you an introduction. But the main point is that one of the reflections is on the 12 links of dependent origination. So it's presented as a way of helping us to see the nature of samsara and wishing to be free and see that this is not a desirable situation. So we have the Four Noble Truths. And that is what the 12 links of dependent origination is really about. The Four Noble Truths. It's about the first two Noble Truths. And so that it's a bit obscure, really. If you hear about the Four Noble Truths, you hear that you have suffering, and you learn about the different kinds of suffering, the three kinds of suffering. And then you learn about the causes of suffering, the karma and afflictions. But then it's not really, it's kind of left to you to figure out, well, how does that cause suffering? It's not obvious. So the 12 links of dependent origination gives you a deeper way to reflect on that. Among the 12 links, all of them are either the truth of the origin or the truth of the result. It's not talking about the latter two truths, although the way to think about that is if you reverse the process. So if you do the opposite, so we'll talk about this, of course, but you start from ignorance up through aging and death, which is the final result. Then if you don't have ignorance, then you don't do the next thing, and then you don't get to the final result. So that is the opposite. Many different ways to contemplate on them. But the presentation, the general presentation of the 12 links is about the first two noble truths.
What do you mean by do it the opposite way?
So there's two ways actually to say the opposite. But the main thing I was saying here is that if you have ignorance, so the Buddha said, for example, from ignorance comes compounding factors. From compounding factors comes consciousness. From consciousness comes name and form, and so on. I'll explain all of that. The opposite would be from the extinction of ignorance is the extinction of compounding factors. And the extinction of compounding factors is the extinction of consciousness. So if you don't have ignorance, it's like you pull out the bottom rung of everything collapses, right? There's no support for the rest of them. So it might sound a little complex, but the main point is if our negative actions keep creating the same situation again and again, then we stop doing those actions, we won't have that same situation. So it's implicit, the latter two noble truths. But the explicit teaching is on the first two, which is about if you have ignorance, then you create karmic actions, and then you have experiences as a result of that. So the 12 links, of course, it's in all of the Buddhist teachings. I mean, in terms of in the Pali Canon and also in the Sanskrit teachings. So the sutra that is most commonly referenced in the Tibetan canon is a Sanskrit sutra. It's a Mahayana sutra. So forgive me because you all know Sanskrit better than I do, I'm sure. But is it Sali Stambana, which means rice seedlings? Yeah, is it Shali or Sali? So Stambana, but Sali or Shali? I don't know the first.
STH.
It is STH. Stali. That means rice or what?
No.
Okay. So yeah, in Tibetan is Salu Jangwe Do. Right. Which also is an ancient term. Nobody calls the rice salu these days, but it might actually be a transliteration of sali. I don't know. Anyway, in this sutra, the Buddha is together with the monks, and they're in the rice fields, and he picks up a handful of rice seedlings. And he says, contemplate all of the causes that went into bringing this about. This is interdependence. So, of course, it came from a seed. That's one thing. But more importantly, it's all of the network of causes that could bring this about. So the seed of the rice, it came from another rice plant before, and that goes back many, many generations. And then, at least nowadays, we talk about evolution of rice and so forth. And then also other causes. There's the supportive conditions that have to be there, the earth and the water and the sunlight, and somebody has to plant it usually. So all kinds of things. Some of you might know Thich Nhat Hanh used to talk about this, that you look at this rice and you can see everything in there. You can see the sunlight and the work that went into it, all of that. it's a good contemplation just in general, right? We don't often think about that when we go and buy food, all of the causes that brought this about, and especially if any of them involved suffering or harm, we want to be mindful of that. But that wasn't the main purpose of the sutra. That was just an example. So the Buddha said, in the same way, you have your experiences now of happiness and suffering. There's all these different causes and conditions that led to that. We get very attached to the present moment and immediate causes without reflecting on the much deeper underlying causes, the evolution that brought this about. So the rice seedlings, that's the external causes. There's two kinds of cause and effect. You have external causes, which we can see with our senses, and then internal causes, which is in the psychophysical being. So that's something that is a little more, we could say it's more controversial for some people, because that very much has to do with certain religious viewpoints. But of course, in Buddhism, it's not meant to be taken on faith. It's something that we have to contemplate and think about and reflect on. So I think that is the main thing, is to try to reflect on what is the cause of suffering. Where does this come about? So I'm experiencing suffering now in my life. There's many different viewpoints on why. Some people will argue that it's random. There's no point in all of this. It's just that physical causation. There's evolution of a physical universe, and then from that comes the formation of planets, and then some planets there's conditions to generate life. Yeah, at least as far as we know, it's only with carbon, water, and so forth. And then that evolves over many, many generations, and gradually you have more complex beings, more intelligent beings that experience suffering. It's just a random aggregation of particles. That's one viewpoint, which in Buddhism, that's a wrong view. Now, again, that's not, we say wrong view, it's not, I'm right, you're wrong. The point is, the Buddha, he felt this was incorrect, and it's something for us to really check on. Not to go and blame everybody else and say everyone else is wrong, but in our own understanding. And then other religious viewpoints, of course. So there are all kinds of different explanations. That's usually why religions come about, is to try to explain why human beings are suffering. And they generally ascribe some kind of meaning to it. It's not just random. So in Christianity, at least in the very, you say, fundamentalist interpretation of it, then it's because one person made a mistake 6,000 years ago, and somebody ate an apple. That might be taken allegorically, but the understanding is that there's some kind of fault that we made. There's something that disconnected us from our true nature. And we're trying to recapture that. That's what the purpose of the spiritual path is. Now, again, as I say, if we take it more allegorically, it actually is quite profound. But anyway, it really depends on how we understand it, and how we understand it is going to very much affect how we act in it as a result. We want to get rid of suffering. Well, if it's all just because of the random aggregation of particles, then really there's no way to be free of suffering entirely. In that viewpoint, suffering is actually useful. It's important because it's a response that was developed by living organisms to alert them to danger. And we have to have that, otherwise we won't survive. So it's an unfortunate byproduct that we don't like it. But we can try to minimize it as best as we can. And that's, whether it's explicitly said or not, that's generally the viewpoint that's underlying much of how the world works today. That the purpose of human existence is to make life more comfortable for as many people as we can.
And cushion ourselves against all the bad bits to the extent that we can.
Right, exactly. So it's not a bad thing per se. I'm glad that life is more comfortable now than it was 1,000 years ago. I think I'd be pretty uncomfortable in a world like that, where I'm not used to living that way, the way things were then. But nevertheless, if we have to eventually ask the question, is this all there is? And then it can actually become a little bit dangerous because we're just, as you say, we're very much attached to the comfort. And then any kind of threat to that, any kind of discomfort is seen as a problem, as opposed to using it to reflect or to advance on the spiritual path, which it can be. If we can help it, as Shantideva says, if we could do something about it, and what we can, but if we can't, then it's time to transform our minds, right? There's no use in seeing it as a problem and wanting to get rid of it. And that's why we get angry. We get angry because the situation doesn't fit in the way that, or doesn't happen in the way that we want it to. So then if your belief is that it was because of God's wrath or something like that, then the understanding would be, well, we should pray to God or follow God's rules to make things better. But here the Buddha said that it's natural causes. There is an evolution. There's a way this happens, and if we understand that, we can reverse the process. So this is why it requires a lot of reflection. So sometimes it's understood, it's really misunderstood. And says when in Buddhism, what we try to do is be mindful of the five aggregates and how they come about. So it's not just thinking simple cause and effect, moment to moment. It's actually being recollecting the process that brought this about. We first have to discern that through wisdom, and then we can recollect that process, and then until gradually it becomes natural to us. When we experience suffering, we have some natural intuitive sense that this is the result of causes that are not just in this lifetime. So it starts with the study, but it's at the same time, it's, some of you might know the term very hidden phenomenon. It's not a very hidden phenomenon, right? If it was, then it wouldn't be something we could access through reasoning. But the evolution of karma, in a general sense, is something that we can access. It's accessible to us, but takes a long time and a lot of work. And it's not just about reading books, although that is part of it. It's also about reflecting on our own experience and meditating and debating about it, even as part of the process. So just some of you might not know this term, very hidden. So we generally, there's a way of understanding all phenomena as classed into three kinds in terms of how they're known. So you have manifest phenomena, that's things that you can experience with your senses, or that you can just experience directly. So, for example, your own mind, you don't see with your senses, but you can experience it, your feelings, things that you don't need to use any kind of reasoning. Now, the mind is a little more tricky because reasoning can actually prevent us from experiencing it. It's said in Buddhism that if we have a particular wrong view about the nature of mind, then we won't actually experience mind as it is, even though it's a manifest phenomenon. So the classical example is some of the Indian Buddhist schools, like the Samkhya we talked about Wednesday, if anyone was here. Did we? Maybe I can't remember where I last talked about it. But anyway, in the Samkhya school, they believe that actually the objects of mind, not the awareness aspect, but emotions and feelings are physical, right? In Buddhist philosophy, the feeling and emotion is not physical. It's also a non-material entity. And we experience that directly. We don't experience it as a physical thing, as an obstructive thing. But we might believe very strongly that it is. That's, again, something that many people believe today. They believe that it's a brain property. If we believe that very strongly, we'll actually be unable to directly experience or notice what's directly appearing in front of us, which is a non-material mind. But anyway, the main point here is we have manifest things that we can experience directly. No one needs to tell us, per se. And even simple causes and effect, like a sprout gives rise to a seed. That is manifest. You don't need to use reasoning to figure that out. You can see it. Now, the underlying causes of where the sprout came about and how genetics works and like that is not manifest. So then we have slightly hidden phenomena, which are ones that are not manifest, but we can access through reasoning. So that would include genetics, for example. That's something that human beings figured out. And then it includes the Four Noble Truths and the 12 links of dependent origination as well. It's something that we don't need clairvoyance to understand this. But then we have very hidden phenomena, which are things that we can't access in either way. So really, that's just very specific things. So in a general sense, reincarnation is not a very hidden phenomenon. It's something that we can access. We can think about. We might not believe in reincarnation, but then we can question, well, why not? Or what if it did exist, how would it function? What kind of world would it have to be? What is mine? What is the nature of mine? What happens at death? These are all kinds of questions that we can ask and talk about, right? But who I was in my past life, that's not something I can really use reasoning to figure out. You can have your opinion, I can have my opinion. If I don't remember it, there's not really any way I can figure it out. So that's a specific instance. And sometimes I like to use the example because it's not just karmic things. I think weather is a very good example. So somebody can train in meteorology and they can understand weather patterns and they can make a prediction about whether it will rain tomorrow, but knowing exactly what's going to happen is very hidden. It requires, because there's too many causes and conditions to know, unless you know every single detail. So there's the common saying, and I guess it's said in Western philosophy, it's also in Western science fiction, that if a butterfly flaps its wings in one place, then there's a hurricane a million years later as a result of that. It might very well be true, but it requires exceptional knowledge of too many causes and conditions for anybody to predict that. So that's generally how science functions. They learn general principles, which are slightly hidden, and then they apply it to situations as best they can, but a lot of things that just remain very hidden. So it's good to distinguish which are which and which are not. And here, in Buddhist philosophy, generally, it's very hidden phenomena, then it requires reliance upon somebody who has clairvoyance. It's the only way to know it. Now, then you have to have some kind of conviction that that person is actually valid. Right? It's interesting story in Tsongkhapa's life that he was very well trained in logic and thinking this way and debate. So he didn't just take things on just because somebody claimed to have some experience of something. And some of you might know the story of his life, that when he was 36 years old, 35, I think, the first time, he consulted a medium. And that medium was channeling Manjushri, the deity Manjushri. But Tsongkhapa didn't just believe it right away. The medium himself was a monk, and he was also quite wise in his outlook. He wasn't sure himself. It's just really Manjushri. So Tsongkhapa tested him. Didn't test the medium, he tested Manjushri and asked him some very deep philosophical questions to see if he could give an answer that only Manjushri might know. He was quite satisfied by that. So that kind of thing, even if somebody claims clairvoyance, we should really check that out very carefully. But that's the only way we can know. Now, what is clairvoyance? I'll have to leave that question because that's a different question, but maybe somebody could know whether a butterfly flapping its wings is going to have such and such result, or somebody could know what action I do now is going to have such result in the future lifetime. And Buddha himself claimed to have such knowledge. So it's not inaccessible, but it's very, very difficult. As we say, very hidden. So, in general, this is not very hidden, the 12 links. That's all we can talk about. We can have a teaching about it.
Venerable,
Yeah.
So you said karma is not very hidden.
In a general sense, no. Specific cause and effect would be what action brings which result. Right?
No, but there's loads of people who don't believe in karma and hence don't see it. And if I, just a regular,
Mm-hmm.
if I had to explain karma to them, or sort of, I just have to, like, it just boils down to faith then, because there is nothing that, I mean,
So a lot of
It's-
people don't believe in evolution. And a lot of people that believe in evolution wouldn't be able to give a suitable explanation to somebody else to convince them.
yeah, but they could point to books, and they could, I mean, there's enough written on the subject that, by like starting from Humboldt and,
Yeah.
Darwin and,
Yeah.
everyone. So they could,
They
could
have a core
study-
body of knowledge that they can point
Exactly.
to.
But that's not true of karma.
Well, we have a lot of good books about reincarnation, not nearly as many as we have about evolution, because it's not as fashionable of a pursuit, but it is something that can be scientifically analyzed.
Reincarnate.
Yeah. Right. So there's many ways to approach it, but the one that's most amenable to science is to study children who remember their past lives and see if there's any truth to what they're saying. Right. So then that's been done quite a lot now, and there's good books I can tell you about if you're interested.
Yeah, could you point?
A good way to start is with Bhikkhu Anulayu's book, because it's meant for Buddhists who are having these questions.
Could you spell?
Yeah, Bhikkhu Anulayu. So the name of the book is simple. It's Rebirth in Early Buddhism and Current Research, I believe. Wisdom Publications. And it's by Bhikkhu. Bhikkhu is Pali for bhikshu. So BHIKKHU.
Yeah.
And Anulayu, Analayo, is a German monk. He's a former college professor, so he knows how to write a very good analytical text. So it presents an overview of a lot of the evidence. The best evidence by far is what Ian Stevenson has done, which is in that book. You could also reference Ian Stevenson's books if you like. Now, traditionally, the people didn't have access to that, but even at the time of the Buddha, there were people who remembered their past lives, and there's stories in the Buddha's lifetime of people looking into this and analyzing it. There's also the story, it's in that book, actually, he talks about of one king who didn't believe in reincarnation, and his example was a bit grotesque, but it is getting quite to the point. He said to the Buddha, he was a king, so he had a criminal he was going to execute, and he said, I put a cauldron in the ground and threw him in the cauldron and locked the top. I didn't see anything exit, so there's nothing going to the next life. So that's assuming that there's some kind of physical thing that's transmigrating. The Buddha said that's not true. It's not physical. Even if nowadays we know, even if it was physical, it wouldn't have to be material per se. It could be some kind of electric or something, whatever. Although that's a bit hard to support. Most people who study reincarnation don't believe it's a physical process. But the point is, just because it's not obvious doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Anyway, but the other way is that people who meditate and then claim recollection of past lives, such as the Buddha himself, we don't have to just take it on faith. We can analyze, what are they saying? Does it make sense? Right? So if the Buddha says, I was such and such person in my past life, to a certain extent, we can check, does that make sense? But generally speaking, we can't really know whether it's true or not simply based on the information. We'd have to have clairvoyance ourselves. But the general picture of it, we could think about. There's also people who do access their past lives through hypnosis. That's also very useful to read about. It's not as scientifically rigorous as the children who remember past lives, mainly because it's too easy, one, to falsify, and also that the person themselves could falsely remember something, especially if it's not verified. That's really what has to happen, is you have to verify it. Although there are a couple cases where that's happened. People recollected their past lives through hypnosis, and then they researched it and found that person and found specific details that they knew that they could not have known through ordinary means. But even beyond that, just simply reading about it, it's helpful to think about it. It happens. People, whether the reincarnation happens is a different question, but there are people who recollect their past life through hypnosis, claim to. So what is it? How do we interpret that? We have to think about it. We can't just reject it. If it's not reincarnation, it has to be something else. But anyway, that only proves reincarnation, right? It doesn't prove that there's karma. And as Ian Stevenson, I mentioned, the researcher on reincarnation, he's very honest about it. He says nothing in his research seems to indicate any kind of karmic causation, as far as he's aware, except certain specific things, like especially birthmarks, right? Which isn't exactly karmic causation, but it's some kind of connection that the person dies in a particular way, and there's a birthmark corresponding to that. Or behavior patterns and preferences, that he notices quite a lot. So that is a kind of karma, actually, in Buddhist philosophy, that people who cultivate a particular skill in a past life are very proficient at it in this life, or who are very attached to a particular person. One of his very interesting cases was a young boy who claimed to have a past life of a young man who had died. He was in love with a young woman, and this young boy was then obsessing about the woman and how can he win her over, even as a young boy. There's another case of a man in Burma who claimed to remember the past life of a man who had died with a wife. So he found that woman who was now 40, he was only 20, but he married her because they were both very attached to each other again. So that kind of thing he sees. But in terms of doing a negative action and experiencing repercussion, he has not seen, except in at least one case. There was someone in Burma who claimed, anyway, although this doesn't have to do with his present life, but he had a recollection of being a murderer, and that was one of his strongest cases. There was a lot of strong evidence connecting the two people, and also he had in this life he had a kind of a stump of an arm. So that would seem to be karma, because he had murdered somebody with the arm. And then the arm was deformed. But also he claimed that in between his life as a murderer and his present life, he had first been born in hell and then been born as an animal. And in this life, he then developed a psychological illness where he thought he was an animal. So that was one case. But in general, it's not something that we see much. It doesn't disprove it. And actually, again, the Buddha said that the specifics of karma, he said, it's inconceivable. It's not just so simple that I do this in this life and I have this exact result the next life. So it would make sense that it's not very easy to see. We'd have to know more than just one past life. And we'd have to be able to put it together. It's like, again, we could measure the weather yesterday and measure the weather today. It might not really line up. Why is the weather like this today? It was like that yesterday. There's many more factors. We're just measuring the weather right here in Bangalore. We don't know the weather in Chennai, which is affecting the weather in Bangalore. So it would make sense that we don't necessarily see a direct causation. But at the same time, yes, it's useful to point out that it has not been shown, and so it doesn't prove it. But again, we can have a talk about this, right? We can have a reasonable conversation about why or why not this would be the case. Yes.
The distinction between slightly hidden phenomena and very hidden phenomena doesn't seem very clear. Because the example you offered was karma, and that's accessible to us like through reason.
Yeah.
Like we can talk about it. And for slightly hidden phenomena. But for very hidden phenomena, you said weather.
Well, specific instances of karma. So I said also, I said two things: specific instances of karma and weather. So again, like with weather, we can someone could train in meteorology, so thereby it has to be slightly hidden that certain low pressure patterns, for example, lead to storms. But then actually applying that to specific situations is very hidden. Could be. You know, we can make general estimations. So likewise with karma, the general functions of karma, I mean, I think Venerable Legden and Kelton have been talking about this the past few weeks, that these are the different kinds of karma. That is accessible. We can talk about it. But then particular ones. So what action I do now, what effect is that going to have in the future lifetime? And right now, what action did I do in a past life that caused me to be born as a human being in this situation? That is very hidden. Yeah. So, okay, so we get to the 12 links now. We had quite a long introduction, but that's good. We'll have to see how much we can get through. So we talk about samsara, right? It's something that is not only in Buddhist philosophy, it's also in many other Indian philosophies, this idea of wheel, right? Cycle. And even in Buddhist philosophy, there's different opinions on what constitutes samsara. But at least in the Madhyamaka understanding, which is what we're following here, then samsara is the 12 links of dependent origination, and it's nothing else. So the truth of suffering is more extensive than that. Truth of suffering includes you and your body and your mind. It also includes the external world. This is the truth of suffering. It's in the nature of suffering. It's contaminated. But your body and your mind are specific, are a little different. They are samsara, because it's the cycle of the 12 links. That's what the wheel is. It's cycling through these 12 links continuously, lifetime after lifetime. So we might say life is just samsara. People might say, well, modern world is just samsara or whatever. But we can use that maybe in a colloquial sense, but we have to be actually, it's good to be aware that that's not samsara. The samsara is you. Now it said it's not you actually, it's your body and your mind, but you are not samsara. It's a distinction. The person cycling is not the cycle itself. You are circling in samsara. Maybe it's just a difference of language, how we use language. Right? But you can be free of samsara. If you were samsara, maybe it would be hard to be free of it. But at the same time, you're not really separate from it, because there's not really a self separate from the body and mind. This is a deeper question. So, okay, so very briefly, we have the 12 links of dependent origination. I'll just say the names now, but then I'll have to tell you what each of them is. So the first link is ignorance, followed by compounding factors, which means karmic action. Then we have consciousness, which means the place on which that action imprints. It does not mean consciousness in a general sense. That can be confusing. Right? You have consciousness before that. Ignorance itself is an instance of consciousness. But it would probably be better to use a different word. I shouldn't say better, because the Buddha didn't choose this word, but it would be easier for us to understand it if we use a different word. It's a namshe, I guess, is probably vijnana. Vijnana in Sanskrit. Yeah. Yeah, it is. So vijnana. Right. But it's, in a general sense, vijnana includes a lot more things. Yeah. But in this particular context, it's just the name we give to the third link. And I'll explain also why that is, but I just wanted to make that clear. It's talking about how is the imprint, when you do an action, it doesn't just disappear, and how is it carried? Where does it go? Then the fourth link is called name and form, which means your body and your mind. Name talks about your mind and your mental factors, and form talks about your body, especially at the time of birth. And then you have the sense spheres, which is something that forms in the womb. Gradually, there's a formation of ears, eyes, nose, tongue, and so forth. Then there's contact. So this is all stages in the womb, right? These 4, 5, and 6. So once the eyes open, and there's contact between what? Contact between three things, between the sense power, consciousness, and an object.
In the womb.
Well, at first, I don't know if the baby opens its eyes in the womb. Probably does. No, maybe not. If it doesn't, but it still has. There's still the touch, right? What's that?
The eyes are formed later for a baby. The eyes are formed first.
Eyes are formed first before the eyelids. So there you go. The eyes are already open. Do they see in the womb? Do we know? We don't know really. But by like the 8th and 9th month, they have eyelids.
Yeah.
Do they have their eyes open? Do we know? Anyway, it's less important. I mean, they can experience something. They can experience physical touch, tactile sensations. They can experience hearing. It is said that the baby can hear the mother talking. They're already familiar with the mother's voice, music and so forth. So there's experience. There's a meeting of the sense powers in consciousness and objects. That's what contact is here. And then there's feeling. There's an associated feeling. That's the next thing. As soon as there's contact, there's some sensation as a result. So then there's craving. As soon as there's feeling, there's craving. Because there's a wish either to continue having that same feeling or to stop having that feeling, to have that feeling again. That comes from past conditioning. Just understood here anyway. And then there's grasping. So once there's craving, then there's grasping. There's intensification of the craving, wanting something. Then there's existence, which is once craving takes what it wants, it creates the seed of a future experience. So I really want to have a nice meal. So that's craving. Then I go to a restaurant. You can say that's grasping. This is just an example. I'll explain more about what they really mean later, but it's an example to have you understand. Grasping, I go to the restaurant, and then there's the existence, which is something's going to happen in the restaurant, right? I can't control that, but I put myself in the situation, so I'm going to have to experience that. So it's future existence, rather than if I just had no craving and no grasping, I wouldn't do any of these things, and I wouldn't have any more experience. But I'm the one who puts myself here because I want something. So then there's birth. Because you start a new experience. And because there's birth and there's aging and death. There would be no aging and death if there was no birth. So you'll see, I use that example. There's actually different ways to understand this. The most simple way is to understand this just in terms of our day-to-day life. So I crave for something. I go to the restaurant. I served a meal. That's birth. It's new. It's wonderful. So tasty. But then there's aging. I eat it, and as I keep eating it, it's less and less food, and I also feel more and more full. And then finally, it's over. What's that? Did it satisfy me? Right, so that's aging and death.
But it doesn't apply to, say, spiritual.
It does, actually. So I said this is the most simple way, but another way to understand it, it's still not the real way in terms of what I'll explain the more deep way, which is in terms of karma, but even to spiritual things, right? So I want to have mental peace. So I do a calming meditation. And then I get into that meditative space, and that's birth, and it's peaceful. Eventually it wears off back in the world. It's aging and death. If it's not it's called in Buddhism a supramundane path, meaning it's not insight into the nature of reality, then in some sense, it's no better than anything else, than any other sense experience. It doesn't create as heavy of a karma, but it doesn't last. It's a conditioned experience. If it's very powerful concentration, it will lead to birth in a heavenly realm, but that will also end. So it's just the same basic point, is the same cycle as everything else. It's all part of the cycle. Right? But those examples, some people do understand it that way. In ancient India, there were schools of Buddhism that understood the 12 links simply in terms of our day-to-day life and our experience moment to moment. And one modern author, a Thai monk named Buddhadasa, he also talks about it that way. So it seems that that understanding was there in Thailand. It's not wrong per se. It as I said, that does accurately reflect our day-to-day life. But the way it's understood anyway in our school, which is following a sangha, that's usually how our under interpretation is following the Indian scholar Asanga, who didn't make it up. Right? It was coming from a long tradition that he was just writing down in a very eloquent way. This understands it in terms of the process of reincarnation. So when it says birth, when it says aging and death, that's meant literally. But then Asanga's explanation of it, it mixes up the order a bit, which actually makes it clearer how it really functions. So there's, in some sense, we can say there's 6 are causes and 6 are results. The causes are the truth of the origin, and the results are the truth of the result of suffering. So the causes are then broken into 2. There's impelling causes and actualizing causes. So the impelling causes are the first 3: ignorance, compounding factors, and consciousness. And then actualizing, what we could say ripening causes, which are more really conditions. So the first 3 are like seeds, then the other 3 causes, which are craving, so 8, 9, and 10, craving, grasping, and existence, that's what cause it to ripen, that cause the seed to ripen. So you need both to create a result. Then you have results, which is 4, 5, 6. That's 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 11 and 12. So name and form, sense powers, contact, feeling, and then birth, and then aging and death. Now those overlap, right? Birth happens at the same time as name and form. So here we can kind of not worry so much about that. We don't have to separate birth from name and form. It's a very eloquent way of talking about it in the sutra. But if we get into technical details, we can just say that we can just really talk mainly about the 4, 5, 6, 7, and not worry so much about 11 and 12 right now. The point is that as a result of the causes, then you're reborn. That's the main point. And then when you're reborn, you develop sense powers and you again experience things in the world. And then you again have feelings, which then you repeat the whole cycle again because you react to the feelings. So we'll start with the first 3, the impelling causes. So this is how we create karma. We create a karmic action. So the first is ignorance. We create an action because we're ignorant. We don't know the nature of reality. So why do people do bad things? Because they don't know better. If they did, not just, okay, people sometimes act out of impulse or whatever, but if they really understood very deeply the consequences of their actions, then they would be very unlikely to engage in them. The problem is that some people actually think it's good to do negative actions. Most people who do negative actions probably do to some extent. They think if I harm this person, it will benefit me. It might not be so good for them. It's against the law. It's not a great thing to do. But I'm doing it because I think my happiness right now is more important. So they have some sense that it actually is beneficial for themselves, which is a wrong view, incorrect. And not even in a worldly sense, that's usually what happens. Most people who engage in criminal activity don't benefit from it. The exceptions, what we usually hear about, but usually it makes their life quite messy. But it's not just negative actions here we're talking about. It's also what we usually would term positive actions. So as you asked, you have meditation. You want to be happy, so you do concentrated meditation. But it's ignorance to believe that that is going to liberate you from samsara. You might pray to be born in heaven, but that is not, if it's not a pure land, which is a little different, which is somewhere where you continue on a path, that's the main thing. You're just praying to have a happy experience rather than praying to be born somewhere where you can follow a spiritual path. And then it's coming from ignorance. So there's all different kinds of ignorance. And that's why I was using examples, right? All the problems in the world, right? So like Tsongkhapa said, all the problems of this world, the root of those is ignorance. That you said, he's saying the Buddha said that. Everything in the world. Now, some people might object to that. They might say, well, there's all kinds of problems that aren't from ignorance. But for one thing, I think some of the obvious examples, war and environmental degradation, are the result of human ignorance, human activity, which is based on human ignorance. It's ignorance of the result, of the cause, of the result of the actions we create. Or knowledge of it, but selective unknowledge, we could say, not wanting to accept these things. Now, other things like cancer, for example, we would say, well, it's not somebody's fault per se. So that's a little deeper. I mean, one thing is if we had a cure, if we had the knowledge to know the cure, we could also cure it. So in that sense, it's from ignorance. But the fact that we're born into a body is out of ignorance. So in the deeper sense, we wouldn't have a body that would get cancer in the first place if we knew more about, if we had in the past life understood karma causation. So that really there's all kinds of ignorance, as I said, there's worldly kinds of ignorance, not knowing the causes of disease. And I actually should say, even with the diseases, to a great extent, it's the result of lifestyle problems, which is a result of ignorance. Oftentimes people don't know how to eat, exercise, or live in a way that doesn't create particular problems. And again, it's not to blame people. All of us have health problems, but to a great extent, it's our own doing. We might not know why. So anyway, that's worldly ignorance, but then we have spiritual ignorance, we could say. Then there's deeper levels of that. So the most coarse level, that is a lack of awareness of cause and effect, karmic cause and effect. So if we don't know that negative actions now have a repercussion in future lifetimes, we might not be so careful with our behavior. And then there's ignorance of the three jewels. And so not knowing or not believing that there's such a thing as an enlightened being, that there's such a thing as a Dharma that was taught that we can practice. There's such a thing as spiritual cultivation and the possibility of being free. And there's such a thing as Sangha, people who have cultivated this path that exists in the world. And then hand in hand with that is not understanding the Four Noble Truths, not understanding the causation between actions. But then the deepest one is not understanding the nature of self. And that is actually, when we talk about the root ignorance, that's the first of the 12 links, that's the main one. So we have a misunderstanding of who we really are. So that's at the root of both positive and negative actions. We have a sense that there's an inherent findable self behind everything else. That is then what leads to everything else. And likewise,
my ignorance is related to my birth, is it?
Well, in a broad sense, yes. Right? It's not like you were born because you were ignorant directly, but in the past life, ignorance of the path to enlightenment prevented us from following that path. And then as a result, we didn't get enlightened, so we were born again.
No, not just that. I mean, maybe I was born as an animal. Maybe I'm born as an animal. In which case, of course, I'll remain for my entire life as an animal, ignorant of all these things, the three jewels and everything.
Well, yeah, it's the same, a human or an animal.
I'm born in a place where I don't have access to.
That's generally because of specific actions, right? Which are rooted in ignorance, but it's not the ignorance itself that directly causes that. Ignorance is understood as a neutral phenomenon. It's not positive or negative, in the sense that it's not a negative action. Wrong views are negative, which is if we tenaciously hold to the wrong view, you say there's no such thing as reincarnation, there's no Buddha, there's no Dharma. It's not bad to question these things, but it's incorrect, and thereby tenaciously holding to it is considered negative karma, negative karmic action. It's a mental action, but simply just being unaware, or even just having the sense of a self, of an inherent self, that's not actually negative, because it can impel positive actions. Somebody can think, I want to be a good person. I want to have a good reputation in society, so I'm going to behave properly. Right? That's rooted in ignorance, but it still motivates positive behavior. But in any case, yeah, so the even birth as an animal, it's not simply ignorance that causes that. It's particular karmic actions. But those come from ignorance. Right? So then ignorance leads to action. Now there's a step we could say in the way, because like Nagarjuna said, I apologize, I can't recite it in Sanskrit, I'll have to recite it in Tibetan. This is if you have Nagarjuna's text, the Root Wisdom, it's chapter 18, verse 5. So the exhaustion of karma and affliction is liberation. Karma and affliction themselves come from how do you say in Sanskrit? Vikalpa, yeah? Conceptual thought. Yeah, and then that comes from, conceptual thought comes from proliferation. And proliferation is stopped by emptiness. It's stopped by understanding emptiness.
Proliferation.
Yeah, so what that means, proliferation means the sense of an inherent self in that context. Then the conceptual thought is not any conceptual thought. It's what we call in Tibetan, again, Sanskrit, it was a sumanichiki nanto, which means inappropriate mental engagement. So it's based on ignorance. Then we form all kinds of exaggerated ways of conceiving the world that are not in accordance with how they are. So the four main ones are thinking that what is actually foul or impure is clean and pure, which is mainly talking about the human body. Now, sometimes people find this a bit offensive. The point here is that one example we could use is you look at dogs, right? You see dogs on the street. The male dog is attracted to the female dog, but to us, it looks quite repulsive, right? But to them, that's the most attractive thing. So it's clear that the mind is imputing that. Likewise, the human body is essentially, if we cut it open, its nature is quite repulsive. We're not attracted to a dissected corpse, right? But we impute this sense that this is attractive and that this is desirable, this is clean. It appears to us very different than it actually is, right? And we usually focus on particular parts of the human body. When we're attracted to a person, we focus on the parts of the body that are attractive to us. We don't focus on the very foul parts of the body, which if we, again, inside the body, for example, we're not attracted to that, but we don't focus on that. We actually often try not to think about that. So people wear perfume, right, to mask their actual nature. They want to appear more attractive to someone else. So that is the most coarse of these views. And then the second one is holding what is actually suffering as happiness, which means seeing things that actually cause suffering for us as being pleasurable. Now, again, an easy example for most of us, if we don't smoke, is going to be cigarettes, right? It looks disgusting to most people. Why would you want to put that in your body? But for somebody who's addicted to it, it's irresistible. So it's the same thing, really, with everything. Everything that all the sense pleasures, in the end, it has the same result. It doesn't, some things are like healthy food, it doesn't immediately harm your physical body, but attachment to it, thinking this is going to bring happiness. So even with healthy food, actually, we could say, if it was really happiness, so talk about broccoli, right? Broccoli is generally considered healthy. So if you just ate broccoli 24 hours a day, would you be happy? You'd probably be sick. So it shows that it's not really happiness. Only a very specific quantity of it is going to bring some kind of temporary respite, right? But even then, you eat broccoli, it can give you indigestion or whatever else, and it's just going to sustain your lifetime in a body that continues to experience suffering. So it's not 100% happiness, and it's not the final happiness. Now, most people don't think broccoli is, but many people might think that particular foods, right? People who are gourmet eaters or wine, their whole life they seek out nice tasting wine, and they'll pay thousands of dollars for one bottle of wine. It's imbued in qualities that aren't there. It doesn't have all those qualities from its own side, and more so than food for most people, it's other people. And we're very attracted to other people, either romantically attracted or to members of our family, and we impute very strongly. And then it's not bad to love your family, but at the same time, it causes suffering. Right? Your sister, your daughter dies. It's very strong suffering. For some people, they never recover. The story of that in the sutras, right? If you might know, Queen Malika was a student of the Buddha, and she was the wife of King Prasenajit, who was the king of Koshala. He didn't believe in the Buddha at first. He was skeptical. He never really became a Buddhist, I don't think. I think he may have taken refuge, but he never really practiced a lot. But his wife, Malika, was one of his most devoted students and sponsors. So the king was a bit skeptical of Buddha, and he'd heard that the Buddha had said that love is suffering. And he said to his wife, well, I have to tell you, and maybe you haven't heard this, but now you're going to have to stop being the Buddha's student, because he said something so ridiculous and you're not going to believe it. And he said, the Buddha said love is suffering. It's laughable. And then, but Queen Malika, she understood the Buddha's teachings to some extent, and actually quite well for a layperson. She then asked the king, well, do you love your daughter, our daughter? And he said, yes. Well, then how would you feel if she died? And then he was a little taken aback. And that's when he started to see what the Buddha was saying. Right? So we impute these qualities. It's not that it's bad. You should take care of your children. It's not saying you should just abandon them. But we over-impute. We expect that this is it in life. For a lot of people, that is ununderstood. That's generally the understanding, whether they're explicit about it or not. Our happiness is going to come from having close loved ones that we care about, that care about us. But this is a sumini chikinanda. It's a wrong conception. And then the last two are a little subtler. There's the view of permanence. It's thinking that things don't change, and they do, right? And then thinking finally that there's a real self, the real me. And that in this context, it's a little coarser than this subtler sense of an inherent self. So it could be coming up with a whole philosophy about me and who I am. I'm a particular soul that was created by God, or I'm an Atman that will reincarnate unchanging, lifetime to lifetime. Everything external changes, but I'm still here, stable.
People say true to myself.
Yeah, true to myself. It's not. So again, we have to be careful that it's not necessarily wrong, right? Saying true to myself, if we understand that it's an idiomatic way of talking. Who is the self that I'm true to? How can I be true to myself? It's like there's two different things, right? Myself is there, I'm going to be true to him. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But still, it is good to be true to yourself, right? It's better than living a lie. So these things come from the root ignorance, and that impels action. That's the step that leads us to the second, to karmic formation. So we engage in any kind of action. Any action we do by body, speech, or mind is creating a karma. But in terms of the second link, this is impelling karma. So it has to be a pretty strong action in this context. And what makes it strong? It's mainly the force of the motivating factor. That's the main thing, but also it can have to do with the object, this power of the object. And it can have to do with the degree to which we complete the action. So if I just imagine doing something, I dream about doing it, I'm still creating karma, but it's much lighter than if I actually did it. And if I ask someone else to do it, it's generally lighter, although it can still be a very heavy action. But if I perform it myself, that's the strongest, and I complete the action, that's the strongest. So here we're talking about very heavy actions. So now, I said very heavy. All kinds of things can be impelling karma. Right? Sometimes we don't realize that actions are very heavy. We might not realize that something negative we said to somebody just offhand because we were annoyed actually really hurt them. And that might be one of the strongest actions in our life. It depends, especially if it's our close member of our family. That's what I said. Particular objects, it said, for example, the parents, one of the strongest objects. So actions done towards them are going to have stronger consequences.
But the strength of an action is not based on how someone else feels about it, right?
Well, that has some bearing on it. It's both, right? It's how strongly my motivation, but it also, the effect also increases the strength of it, right? So
but then that means you're at the mercy of external things, whereas I thought Buddhism said that you concentrate on yourself, and of course external does play a part, but as long as your motivation is right. So I might call my child maybe an idiot. I might say it to prevent him or her from doing something bad, but they might just hear the word idiot and get terribly upset. But my motivation in using that word was to maybe prevent them from doing some harm. So how someone feels about it affects the strength of my action. That's not okay. I mean,
well, so it's both,
it's
right?
also random then.
Well, it's not random per se, but it's generally speaking, yes, we are in control, but it's not entirely the case. We live in an interdependent world. And really the best thing is to be as careful as we can with our actions because we don't know the effects that could happen. Right? So at the same time that we don't know how it's going to affect them, we don't know the effect it's going to have for us in a future lifetime. Something we thought was a very minor action could have a very strong effect. And so we live in a web almost connected with others, right? In the end, it does come down to us, but we're very affected by others too. And the degree to which our actions affect them, like for example, if we step on a bug not unintentionally, there is karma created. It's much lighter than if we did it intentionally. But it's still there. You could say, well, you can't help it. Well, there's two things. One is that's part of the problem of being born into a human body. We're born into a situation where we can't help but harm others. That's why it's part of the undesirability of it. Karma just repeats itself. But secondly, we could be more careful. We could also not walk, right? Some religious practitioners, the Jains, they're extremely careful about this. So we have a choice, right? Personally, that's one of the main reasons I try as much as possible not to get in vehicles. I try to walk when I can. Or if I take a vehicle, try to take public transportation. Because every time I'm in a vehicle, it's of course harming the environment, but it's also harming many insects. So we have to be aware of every action we're doing has all kinds of effects. And Okay, well, you could say, I didn't know it was doing that. Well, that's why we should, that's essentially ignorance. Just being ignorant it might excuse us from the law, but in terms of karma, we're not aware of the consequences of our actions. This is why we need to focus, learn more about it. We're not aware that calling my child an idiot actually had that effect on him. But if we really practice more mindfulness, we might actually realize the effect of our actions. Right? Some people don't realize that how much their words hurt other people. So it's something that's why we need to actually cultivate that wisdom. Otherwise, we'll continue to create negative actions unknowingly, even though we have good intentions. It's certainly better than having bad intentions. It's heavier if we have bad intentions, but we can still create negative actions with good intentions. So it shouldn't necessarily be discouraging, right? You can feel, well, there's so much, I'm so powerless, but the point is to recognize the situation we're in, that it's not desirable, and we have to make a lot of effort if we want to get out of it. And also not to be too hard on ourselves also, right? We can't help everything, which is the nature of being human, that we don't always do the right thing, even if we want to. So it's not to blame yourself. It's just a matter of having a motivation, a feeling that I wish to cultivate, I wish to improve this situation. And sometimes people misunderstand the Buddhist teachings on contentment and think that it means just be okay and accept yourself as who you are. It's not that the Buddha was saying you should beat on yourself. Nowadays it's a bit complex in psychology. People have low self-esteem. But it's the Buddha was not saying you're okay just as you are. He was saying you really need to change the way you are. The contentment is talking about the things we can't change, especially our external circumstances, not to get too worried about, not to keep trying to make things more and more comfortable. But in terms of our inner self, our mind, we should feel quite a sense of urgency and wish to really change that, not just say it's okay as it is. Right? But again, it's a subtle psychological thing. We don't want to get into this trap of that I'm no good and I can't do anything. That's counterproductive. So we have actions. So there's two kinds of actions essentially. There's ones that are impelling actions, like I've talked about, and then one that's called completing. So that's not what's talked about here, but it's useful to know about that. So any other detail of your life. So an impelling action is going to cause you to be reborn in a particular way. A completing action is then going to fill in the details of that life or many lives. And there's overlap. It's not like one action isn't necessarily impelling and necessarily completing. So for example, if I were to kill somebody, it could be an impelling action, it could create a future lifetime. But it could also do something even worse in this lifetime. And thereby that impelling action doesn't ripen as a impelling action, it ripens as details in that lifetime. So it actually becomes a completing action. Or it could ripen twice. I could be born twice from the same action. And then there's still a little bit left over. It still hasn't finished, so then it becomes a completing action in another future lifetime. So if I kill somebody and then I'm born in an unfortunate migration twice, and then I'm born as a human again, but I have a short life. So it becomes a completing action in that lifetime. So that it can be all kinds of things, but generally speaking, what we're talking about here to pinpoint it is when it's an impelling action. So then we have consciousness, as I said, so not to misunderstand, it's not consciousness in a general sense, it's the imprinting of that action. This is harder to understand, but it's very important. And this is more controversial, even among Buddhist philosophers, of what this actually is, what's happening here. But the main point, I think the way that my teacher described it to me that is very helpful, is think about when you do an action. If you're very angry and you do something, right? The moment you've done it, that emotion doesn't immediately dissipate. You're still there. You're breathing heavily. That's the conscious link of consciousness. When there's a kind of sense it's done, but you're still very focused on the action. And it's imprinting something on your consciousness. Then gradually you start thinking about something else and go on with other activities and something else, right? Because you think about, worry about something else, you might forget about it, right? But it's imprinted on your consciousness. We know this through modern experiments in psychology. You never really forget it, even if you might forget it consciously. Through hypnosis, people can recollect things that they once forgot. So it's still there. And that is carried with you. Now, the question here, as I said, it's a debate of what's debated among the Buddhist philosophers is, what is that? Right? So, and how is it stored? That's a very hard question. So, for example, the Chittamatra, the mind-only school, they had a whole philosophy of this all-ground consciousness, Laya Vijnana. That's what's carrying it. That third link is that. It's imprinting on the Laya Vijnana, the subtle consciousness. But however we talk about it, the main point is that it's imprinted. Now, again, as I said, this is not very hidden, but it's also very difficult. Right? So what is a karmic imprint and how is it carried? I don't have time to talk about that now, unfortunately. But it's definitely worth talking about. Sometimes people misunderstand the Buddha. There's some teaching when he said, don't talk about the results of karma. It's taken out of context. The Buddha was saying, don't talk about the results, very hidden karma results. So there were a bunch of monks speculating, who was I in my past life, this or that. It's basically idle talk, because you don't know. Unless you have clairvoyance, that's very different. And then it just becomes, then we could say, oh, you're going to be reborn in this way because of this action. You don't really know. But some people misunderstand that to say the Buddha said you should not talk about karma in a general sense. That's incorrect. That's very clearly stated. You can look, if you look through the Buddha's sutras, it's inconsistent with other things he said other places. So it's very good to talk about how could this happen. Otherwise, we won't believe it. Right? We have to really get some confidence that this could happen. This could be true. How would it work? Now, what I sometimes say is that, and this is actually explicit in the some sutras themselves, it has to do with memory, really. Function of karma and the function of memory are very similar. And just like memory is not something that, in my opinion, how do you say, adequate is not the right word. Satisfying scientific explanation, then there's not a scientific explanation for karma. Now, most scientists would deny it, but they would accept memory because it's very obvious something we can all experience. However, it's not something we can explain. Where is memory stored? Right? It's quite actually well known now that it's like hippocampus in the brain has something to do with memory, but it's not where it's stored. It's very clear because if somebody has their hippocampus removed, they can't form new memories, but they can remember other things that happened before. So it's not stored there. Otherwise, they throw it out with the hippocampus. If it is stored somewhere in the brain, the question is where and how? What would it even mean for it to be stored in a physical way? The Buddhist philosophers rejected that it could be stored in a physical medium, but it's worth considering. We know the brain a lot better today than they did then. But there's all kinds of conceptual problems with it. And I've certainly, my reading of neuroscience is basically that if you really ask, neuroscientists will admit we really don't know. And there was an interesting article in Scientific American about 10 years ago. I sometimes joke about this, and I wish I can't find the article again. I read it many years ago, and I wish I could locate it so I could quote it specifically or reference it. But anyway, the main point was The article started out by saying, as ephemeral as memories seem, they have a firm biological basis. But that is a thesis statement, essentially. It begs for proof, doesn't it? Saying they have a firm biological basis implies they're going to go on to explain what that is. Then the article goes on to say that we used to think that memories were stored in the connection between neurons. But it goes on to present counter evidence to show that that doesn't work. There's reason to think that it's not stored in the connection between neurons based on certain experiments, and I don't remember the details of that. So they said that now some people think it's stored in individual neurons in some kind of microscopic way or whatever, and then showing that that is problematic also. So the article ends with, we hope someday to find the biological basis of memory. So if you look at the beginning and the end, it contradicts itself, right? It's just an assumption that it has a firm biological basis. But it's so strongly assumed that they don't even notice that they're contradicting themselves. The assumption, essentially, the reasoning I think that would be given if asked would be twofold. One is that there's nowhere else it can be stored because everything is physical. It's just the way the world is. And secondly, that there's clear evidence that damaging the brain impairs memory. But that has the same problems that I just mentioned, that if that was the case, we should be able to damage very specific parts of the brain and erase memory. But even with people who have damage to parts of the brain, so the hippocampus is not associated with long-term memory, but there are parts of the brain that seem to be more associated with it. So people have damage to that, and they cannot have long-term memories, like people who have amnesia, we would say colloquially. There's some evidence that they actually do remember at some level. For example, when shown pictures of family members who they don't claim to recognize, there is a visceral response in the body. Something is recognizing it. They just aren't consciously aware of that. So the point here is that it's a similar function. There is a storage of record of past experiences. Now, record is a loaded term, right? We have like Akashic records. I don't know if is that actually a term in Hinduism, or is it something that Annie Besant made up? Is it a woman? Annie Besant was a Western psychic who believed that she had access to what she called Akashic records.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it actually a word in Hindu philosophy? Yeah. So the idea that is what we'd say in Buddhism anyway, very coarse understanding. There's some kind of record in the sky and somebody's writing it down. But it's one way maybe Hindus don't understand it that way either. But the point is that would be a very, in Christianity too, that there's St. Peter or whoever is writing down all your actions in your lifetime, right? Well, how else do you explain it? So if you want to explain it to a child, maybe that's how you explain it. But there's maybe more subtle ways of understanding it. And the different Buddhist schools have different ways of understanding this. And I think, the most advanced one, we would say in our system anyway, is Chandrakirti's explanation, which is complex and hard to understand. But my general take on it is he's saying that we have the problem is our whole conception that there's a self that carries karma to an inherently existent future. That we think about it based on our way of experiencing the world, which is not in accordance with the way it actually is. There's not such a strong disconnect between past and the future and the present. And there's no self that's traveling through time. So really, to understand karma, we have to understand emptiness. This seems to be his message. So I've gone on a sidetrack there actually a bit. It's very important, but we're still in the third link here, right?
No, but that still doesn't explain what Chandrakirti's explanation that you offered.
Yes.
Is that the notion of a self going forward in time itself is empty? Is that what you said?
So it's a convention, right? It is conventionally true, but it's not the way things actually are upon examination, right? So just in a general sense, if I say I remember when I was 3 years old, that's conventionally true, right? Versus somebody who has a false memory and They remember that when I was 3 years old, I went with my mother to the zoo in Mysore, that it actually didn't happen. I don't have correct memories. But then there's problems if you actually examine it. Who is the self? Like me now is very different from me then. Right? There's a different body, different mind. What's the continuity? What is that actually that I'm remembering? Right? Then it gets problematic. Conventionally, it's true, but on analysis, it's almost impossible to pinpoint. It falls apart. Yeah. Now, that explanation, very brief explanation, certainly doesn't explain it per se, but it's just an introduction, at least, to what he's saying. But we have to think very deeply about the implications of it. He talks a lot about memory also, and how memories are formed, and how things are remembered at. Not just in terms of the process of karma, but it seems to be related, is the idea. Nagarjuna, Karnakirti does not consider himself an original thinker. He believes he's interpreting Nagarjuna, who is just a bit more esoteric. So Nagarjuna said, it once was here, but now it's gone. That is the view of severance, meaning it's a nihilistic view. Think that something existed and it went out of existence. It's not the way things work. So I think we'll have to leave it there. Then we have the third link. So then the next important thing is to jump to the other links, the craving. So the 8, 9, 10, so the other causes, which are the ripening causes or the actualizing causes. So you do this action, and then it's imprinted in your consciousness. Right? So later in your life or another lifetime, most likely in another lifetime, actually, then you have craving. You have the wish to do something. That essentially is coming from sort of like an itch. There's something inside that's not right, it's not balanced. That's the imprints of your past actions. And that it impels you to want to act, to do something, to change things, change the way things are, because you don't feel whole inside. So we have sometimes those horror movies, I don't know, horror, or like, what's the word? Not quite horror, but like ghost movies. I don't know. There's one I saw when I was very young, and there's like this person who has the hidden amulet, and if you wear the amulet, then the ghost can come and overtake you. So they lock the amulet in a trunk in the basement, so no one takes it. But then this woman wakes up in the night, almost hypnotized, and wanders down and opens it and puts it on. It's actually a good analogy for what's happening here, right? We hide something away, but we have this impulse to do something, and that reawakens it. We can't help ourselves. And so, because it's still there, it's wanting to ripen. So we don't even know what's motivating us consciously, but we do so. We act. So we have this itch, and we want to scratch the itch. So we act. We have craving in life, and that intensifies, and then we have grasping. But what it's specifically talking about here in the terms of the 12 links is at the moment of death. So your whole life you have craving. At the moment of death, that pattern continues. Sometimes people will voice that at the time of death. They'll say, I wish I could come back and be this or that. I wish I had. They might not believe in reincarnation. They might even still say that. Sometimes that happens. But even if they don't, they might say, I wish I could just be back when I was 20 years old and living that, having my youth again. Or I wish I could just, a lot of people I've heard, and they talk about their deceased spouse, right? I wish I could be with her again, right? So that's at the time of death. There's a grasping it, a future experience. That's exactly what will cause the person to be reborn. I like to think about it as rolling the dice, right? You're throwing yourself back in, but what ripens is very much dependent on your karma. So like that woman who goes and takes the amulet, right? Puts it on, and she's actually exposing herself to harm in the future. And said in the Buddhist text, for example, like somebody who slaughters sheep his whole life, time of death, he has a vision of a sheep and he wants to go slaughter it. It's exactly what's throwing him into hell. Yourself, so people feel, you say you feel very cold, you want to be hot. So that's a very extreme example, but it's a general understanding of what's happening here. We ourselves want something different. So we're following on our past karma. We don't, well, rather than distancing ourselves from it and trying to prevent it from ripening, we're feeding it. So then that becomes existence. That's the 10th link, which is the consciousness at the moment of death. So at the moment, just before you're dying, there's these last thoughts of life, which are very karmically heavy. That's why it said it's very important how you die and to be trying to do some kind of positive mental state, positive spiritual practice at the time of death. Because even if you've had very negative karmic actions in your lifetime, if you die with a positive mind, you might not ripen them. Whereas on the other hand, if you've done very positive things, but at the time of death, you just regret everything you did and think it's all just a waste, I just wasted my life. Then
many times people are actually suffering physically quite a lot. So maybe that is the most prominent thing in their mind.
Yeah.
The suffering.
Yeah, that's true. That's why it's very important to prepare. Right? It's not easy at the time of death to generate a positive mental state if you're in a lot of pain. So that's how it's not said, yes, that can happen, but don't count on it. Right? Don't think I'll just do negative actions my whole life, but then I'll have positive thoughts at death. It's very unlikely. Anyway, as the consciousness starts to absorb, to dissolve, even that fades away. But those last thoughts are then carried into that last moment of the consciousness that will then connect it to a future lifetime, future experience. So that's why it's called existence. It's meaning it's connecting to future existence. Right? So how does that happen also? If you have imprints, right? It's understandable to some extent. I did a past action and the imprint ripens at death. I have a particular mental state. How does that create a new life? How does that affect the physical world? And there's two ways to see it. One is just in terms of transmigration, we could say reincarnation. We're drawn like a magnet to experiences that are congruent with our inner state. So you did a lot of violence, you're drawn to being born in a place where there's a lot of violence. But can it actually create the physical world? Most Buddhist schools believe yes. Right? That's a different question. So really the question is, can the mind affect the physical world? That's the main question here. And again, I think that's something we can really think about with the tools we have. It's not just esoteric entirely. The details might be. So many of us might think, especially if we're trained in modern science, that that's just absolutely impossible because things have physical causes. As I often say, if classical physics was true, then it wouldn't be possible. Classical physics leaves no room for a non-physical cause. It's just logically incoherent because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So something has to be physical to have a physical result. But we know that that classical physics is not true. And as I often also say, that quantum mechanics, which has replaced classical physics, we have to be very careful because some people just rush to conclusions that this justifies my spiritual belief system. Right? It's not quite so obvious nowadays, but the main point is it doesn't mean it's not possible. And actually, we could say a fundamentalist interpretation of quantum mechanics, one that sticks most directly to the facts and not to interpretations of it, implies that the mind actually does affect the physical world. And this is called the Copenhagen interpretation, which was then developed furthermore by von Neumann and Wagner, I think it's the names. Von Neumann I know for sure. Which is the whole basis of how quantum mechanics is actually applied today. And von Neumann himself believed that mind was a fundamental property of the universe based on his understanding of quantum mechanics. But it's, it's not taken into account by most philosophical pictures today based on science. They don't, but the point is to say that the mind cannot affect the physical reality. Whether, for example, if I think something, it's going to have some effect on the external reality. That's a very different question, right? Nothing in quantum mechanics at the moment shows that. It has to do with very subtle particles, essentially. So if I just want to set the wall on fire, can I just like that and it sets on fire? Well, that's a much different question, right? So we have, and it's good to say, well, you better prove it to me, right? So it's good to look at evidence of that and what kind of explanation might be offered with how that could happen, because Buddhist texts do say that can happen. But likewise with reincarnation, actually, I think there's a lot more evidence than most people are aware of for this kind of thing. And it shouldn't feel bad about exploring it, but also approach it very skeptically. Don't just accept it either. But the whole understanding here is that there is also collective karma, and the world we are in is the collective manifestation of the karma of all of the beings who are experiencing it. Right? So karma does work that way. And it's not simply an individual process, as to your question, right? But what we experience will be individual to us. So I sometimes think about it. I'm an American, and there's a lot of, at the moment anyway, been a lot of upheaval in my country. That's also my karma. But at the same time, I am not there. I'm not experiencing it so directly as a lot of other people I know. So at least at the moment, so far, maybe my karma to experience it is not as strong. The example that's often given is like an earthquake. Many people have the karma to experience it, but some people just don't experience, they're spared, or they just happen to be in the right place where it doesn't affect them so much. So everybody has their own individual experience too.
Or that man in the flight.
Yeah, the Deepti just sent that to me today. Yeah, that's the idea there, right? What can happen? Again, if it was purely physical causes, then it's ludicrous to talk about this having anything to do with our mind. But that's what we'd say is a very hidden phenomenon. What really caused that? There's examples in the sutras, like, for example, Queen Malika, who I mentioned. She was the student of the Buddha, but later another wife of Prasenajit, because of course he had more than one wife, became jealous of her. And so she burned down the palace with Malika and her friends, and most of them died, except for one who escaped. And the Buddha said that that was the result of Queen Malika and her friends. In a past life, they had been passing by a hut where a Prayitika Buddha had been in meditation. They burned it down. That doesn't sound like they were malicious. It was just, I don't know, they wanted to burn it down for some reason. Maybe it's clear in the story, I can't remember. But that one woman who escaped, she had objected to what they were doing. Now, I think that might even, in some sense, it could be understood it's a bit simplistic. It might be that the Buddha was just saying this, trying to point out the kind of things that could happen, but it could be a lot more complex than that, right? Because they did many other actions, many other lifetimes. That's why it's inconceivable. All of this came together to form this current situation, right? But the ingredients were there, we could say, right? You have many different ingredients. You mix them in a soup, it's going to have a very specific flavor. it can't be reduced to any one of those, but at the same time, it's the collective result of all of those put together and mixed together. Just how it manifests is inconceivable. You'd have to know every little detail.
Yeah, one of the ex-chief ministers on that Air India flight,
Yeah.
he had originally booked for the 5th.
Yeah.
And then he switched to 12th.
Yeah, there's that too. Yeah. There's those kinds of things. And there are definitely a lot of stories. And that's, again, it's just an anecdote. Something is just an anecdote as long as it's a story. But if somebody collects the anecdotes in a systematic way and then analyzes the evidence and finds a way to calculate it against probability, then it can be something more than that, right? So if we collect stories of people who say, I was going to go on this plane, but then I had a dream of a plane crash and I didn't go, and then it crashed, right? It's just, well, maybe just random. Maybe somebody would argue, how many people had dreams of plane crashes the previous night that didn't do that? It just happens to be that in this case. But if we collect enough examples of it, it becomes stronger. I don't know that happening in terms of premonitions that way per se, but something certainly that has been collected is people who have visions of people who died. It seems to be very common that if somebody has a relative who dies and are aware of it, that they have a vision of them. Before, sometimes before, sometimes after, but the main thing is before they could have known through normal means, right? Some of you might know Mark Twain, the American author, who traveled to India because he was very interested in Indian spirituality. That's how he got interested, because he had a dream of his brother dying in Missouri, I think. And he was very far away, and it happened. So he was then open to this possibility. That's very common. As I said, that there's been a lot of a collection of those stories and analysis of them. And it seems to happen. I forget the number, but I mean, I forget what the number means, but it's like, yeah, it's like over half the time when people have a relative that dies and they're not aware of it, they have some way of experiencing it psychically before they are told the news. Okay, so this is, I think we actually have to wrap up now, but I think you understand the basic point here. We can't really complete the 12 links all in a single day anyway. Right, so then you have birth, right? The rest of them kind of fall into place. You have birth and you have sense powers that form. And then the most important one is the feeling, as I mentioned, because that's what leads to further craving. The cycle repeats itself. So yeah, we're basically at the end of the time. So I should probably, we already have had some questions, but I can open it up to questions. And I think Venerable Legden had suggested I do a meditation, although I don't know that we have a lot of time for that, but we could try shortly. But first, let's have question and answer. Yeah, please.
You said this discussion of the 12 links comes from a Sangha.
Yeah.
I might be mistaken, but wasn't he like a proponent of the Chitta Matra school?
Yes, he was. So yes, the Sangha was that's also a bit complex. So for one, the first answer to your question is yes, a Sangha was a Chitta Matran philosopher. His most important texts, such as so I'm trying to remember the Sanskrit name. Abhidhamma Samuchaya is one. And then Tektu Mahayana Samgraha is Tektu. And then Tandapapadua, I do not remember the name in Sanskrit. But anyway, his most important texts were Chitta Matran texts, but they are still considered to be the most important text in terms of explaining conventional reality and the method side of the path. So even in Madhyamaka philosophy, they follow his text in that regard. It's just the explanation of emptiness and the explanation of the alaya vijnana that they disagree with. But there are no Madhyamaka texts that explain reality in karma and the practices of like the bodhisattva and so forth in any more than details. So that's what we use. But in our monastery, we study his texts studied the stages of the path for 7 years, which is heavily based on his texts. But then I was going to say also, the understanding anyway, it's very disputable, I think, but it's how Tibetans, at least the Gaelic school understands it, is that they believe he was actually a Madhyamaka philosopher. They base this on his text, on his commentary on the Uttara Tantra, which they take as a Madhyamaka text. And they say that his exposition of the Chittamatra was to help others understand. It wasn't his final view. I think it could be controversial, because then we could dispute, well, maybe he didn't write that text, that the one that says something else, because that's exactly what they say about Vasubandhu. There are many texts attributed to Vasubandhu that seem to present a different viewpoint than his Chittamatra view. And Tsongkhapa anyway says, well, they weren't written by Vasubandhu. So it would really take some historical analysis, but that's kind of a side point. The main text we're talking about, yes, they're Chittamatra texts. But we take, in terms of their presentation of karma, it's a lot of overlap.
The Alaya Vijnana is a good way of explaining how in principle.
Oh, yeah, Alaya Vijnana is wonderful. We studied that for one semester at Sarah, and I loved that. When we studied that in 8th year of our program, I thought that was the best thing we've studied so far. And I also think it's true what they say, that if you don't really understand the Chittamatra view, then it's very hard to really understand the Madhyamaka view, because they're taking that as a basis, like a foil, something that they're, like Chandakirti, when he talks about how karma works, he says, in contradiction to the Alaya Vijnana, he says, although there's no Alaya Vijnana, it can still work. But in terms of a lot of the details, it's the same. So it's not like he's saying that there isn't karmic imprints, or that the world is not a manifestation of karma. He's just saying that their particular way of understanding it was not, that's what he's attacking, but he's not attacking the system as a whole. And in any case, it's a very powerful way to meditate. And it's still done in some countries. In Japan, there are still Chittamatras, still people who have this view, and it's very influential in China and Japan anyway, and in Tibet, among a lot of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, although they don't claim to be Chittamatrans, they're heavily influenced by it. So it's certainly not something just to discard. Yeah. So there's a good book by Choe Khor called The Influence of Yogacara, which is Chittamatra. The Influence of Yogacara on Mahamudra, I think is the name. And it's very nice. And he shows how Tibetans, it's like Chittamatra was a 6th century philosophy. It's a bit unwieldy, we could say. It has some sort of coarse presentations. So the Tibetans, maybe they made it a little subtler and refined it a bit. But the general ideas are there. And yes, in Dzogchen meditation, they do talk about Alaya Vijnana, although they would anyway claim that they mean something different than what the Chittamatras mean by Alaya Vijnana. And it's not the most subtle level of mind, whereas the Alaya Vijnana is understood as the most subtle level of mind. But it's a very useful concept and something to really consider. And there's a lot of talk about how does it overlap with the modern understanding of the unconscious mind. So it's
Who is
yeah.
the author, you said?
Choe Khor. So TRAELEG, and then KYABGON. Yeah, he's passed away now. I don't know much about him. We have several of his books in our library. I don't know much about his history, though, or what school he even belonged to. It's not explicitly said. Yeah.
If you look at the EFTMT side, if you look at the purification practice, one of the steps that's recommended is meditate on the act that you've committed as being empty of inherent origin, including the karma that you accumulated. So I've always found that very curious. So by meditating on the act and the associated karma as being empty, somehow is supposed to weaken its.
Yeah, it's supposed to purify it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing is that it's certainly you need to have a fairly advanced understanding of emptiness for it to really purify it. And so we don't want to fall into the trap of kind of there's some kind of rule that I did a bad thing, but now I just sit and think about emptiness for a few minutes and it's okay. It's not quite like that. But one way to think about it is this, that if you did a very negative action, try to think about what caused you to act that way. Right. So I spoke in a way that was unskillful, but then I recognized that I was carrying all of these habitual tendencies that from my childhood, the way I was raised and the way that the society I was in. And see, it's not just me doing the action, so I don't blame myself. I think I start to have some distance from it. That is a kind of purification if it's done properly. And that is a kind of meditation on emptiness. It's dependent arising, which is emptiness. It's an understanding of emptiness if you understand dependent arising. So you don't, it's still good to, it doesn't just mean you say, oh, it's okay, and I let go of it, but it can help us to not cling so much to it, because actually the more we cling to it as real, it actually gets stronger, right? It's not that we should just forget it, but we can look into it and examine what's actually happening. Then there can be an opportunity for spiritual progress rather than being an obstacle.
Yeah, I think the dependent origination explanation was
Yeah.
insightful. Thanks.
Okay. Is there any questions online? Oh, so there's the chat. Is anyone looking at it other than me?
No.
There's 8 on the chat, 8 messages on the chat. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So I apologize. Somebody said a while ago, be closer to the mic. Let's see.
You want us to put it?
Well, let me just see if there's any questions here. Oh, okay. So there was a question. Soft copy of the text I'm mentioning. I'm not sure what text I was mentioning. Let's see. Isn't it true that our subtle mind stream carries the karmic seeds and travels to the next life? Generally, yes. Right? So the Madhyamaka, they don't reject that there's subtle mind. What they reject is that it's substantially different from the coarse mind. Right? That there's a subtle mind that's an eighth consciousness, that's what the Chittamatra believe, that's completely different from our waking consciousness. It's just that there's different levels of mind. One mind can be subtle now and can then manifest as a coarse mind and so forth. Mind is fragmented in some sense. So it's not just like we have one mind, one singularity. There's a lot of things about ourselves of which we're unaware. And essentially that's what's going to go to the next life. The coarse aspects of mind, who I conceive of myself as now, that's just a little bit. That's like the tip of the iceberg. And that won't directly go to the next life. It's not like I'm going to stay as myself and go there. It's likewise when we're dreaming, right? Oftentimes we're not ourselves in our dream. So that's those subtler levels of mind are becoming manifest. The same thing that will happen when we die. We're not awake anymore per se. So those will just manifest and play themselves out. We don't have control over it. Okay. So I think, yeah, it's already over time. So why don't we close briefly, but we can do a very short meditation. Okay. So just for 1 minute, just first come back your breath becomes centered here, present moment. Okay, so Asanga said that when we do an impelling action, it's like firing an arrow in the sky. Those arrows are there, and they're waiting to fall back on us. So we can think this way, that we are carrying all of these imprints, the collective accumulation of all actions of this life and previous lifetimes, loaded with all of this. Yet we don't relate to it. We don't look at it. We just keep creating more and more. So have the sense, why would I want to do that? It's like somebody who just goes from relationship to relationship. That last one isn't resolved, but they just start a new one. And then the same problems happen again, the same patterns, and then stops to work, so they go to another one. Rather than continuing that cycle, rather than seeking something else outside of ourselves, can we turn inward and start to experience these aspects of ourselves? So it requires cultivating some space and some quiet. And within that, we can start to say, what is going on here? What's inside of me? Because, as we just mentioned, that is what we mean by purification. We're not going to get something outside of ourselves. It's about understanding. It's about bringing wholeness and bringing awareness to these imprints in our mind that it's like a stranger, something that is somehow familiar, but at the same time, it's so different. Otherwise, life is just the same thing over and over again. Same thoughts, same experiences. We really want something new. It's good to turn inside. So just for a minute, try to be present with that. And if we feel so impelled, we can now say, we can make the determination. May I devote myself to this? May I follow a spiritual path, an inner path? And I stop craving for new experiences and constantly seeking external things and start to address what's there, start to become friendly with myself and start to devote my energies to dismantling this structure that I have created within myself. It's not always easy, but we feel determined it's worthwhile. We can just for a moment try to set that kind of motivation if we feel that that's the right thing to do. Okay, thank you. Apologies that we went a little over time. We can just do a very brief verse of dedication to finish. On page 36 of this book here. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly become we attain the state of a Guru Buddha, and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And finally, pray that the Yangzi, the reincarnation of your Lama Thubten Yeshe, may quickly be free of obstacles to manifesting another lifetime equal or surpassing the deeds of the previous one. Continue to guide us on this path in this and future lifetimes. Okay, thank you very much. So tomorrow morning, Venerable Ligton sent me a whole list of things I could talk about, and I haven't actually decided what I'll talk about yet. But I thought maybe it's good I'll talk a little bit about the Bodhisattva path, because that seems to be the themes that they've been talking about. In a general sense, why would we want to follow such a path? Maybe it's already been covered a bit, but and then I'll choose a couple of the other topics that he mentioned. But it's a little more free tomorrow. It's not so much of a philosophical or a structured talk. It'll be more open about general ideas of Buddhist philosophy, or generally about life, you could say. So be open to what other people are interested in also. Okay. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
No, that's exactly what I wanted to say
Okay.
about tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
I wanted to remind everyone online and here to
Yeah. Okay.
join us at 10.
Yeah, so 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, you say. Yeah. Okay.
Also, if I may add, I think Venerable Gache has written an article about the.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I wrote an article. So for those of you, or I can tell all of you use online, and there's an article I wrote in the 12 links. It's called Personalizing the 12 Links of Dependent Origination. It's now it's available on the FPMT website. And
Sorry, what's it called?
Personalizing the 12 Links of Dependent Origination. And actually, I received a mail from Venerable Rabina last year, I think. I was happy to hear that it's still being used. She said that she's been using it for prisoners, because she does the Liberation Prison Project. And she reformatted the article and to make it more pedagogical and easier to access the information in it. And she sent me just to ask my permission for that, which I said I'm happy it's being used. So maybe I didn't even think of this, but I should probably share. I probably have that, which she sent me, and I'd be helpful for people. Maybe I could share that. So I'll try to remember to do that, or maybe someone can remind me.
But otherwise, if you go to the FCM.
Yeah, the FMU website, you can just get the article itself. Yeah, personalizing the 12 link dependent origination. I wrote it 9 years ago, so my views may have changed a bit, but the main points are pretty much the same. I don't think I said the exact same thing today as I did then. And also, when after I wrote that, then they asked me to talk about it at Kurikula Center. So you can also find that talk, which has quite different points than I talked about today, I think. So if you just look on YouTube for Tenzin Gache, dependent origination or something, 12 links of dependent origination, Kurikula Center, and I think it's available still. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much.
I don't know what you like, so I bought pasta.
I get everything.
It's some fruit that's like a local fruit. I don't know if everybody does this.
Yeah, jamun, I like jamun.
Some things to munch on.
Oh. I'll have to. We'll put them in my bag for Sarah.
Okay.
I'll be in the bus tomorrow. Thank you very much.
It's for you tomorrow, so. Some help. Yes.
There's not a
I don't plan. I don't have a plan, so either someone will bring me back, but I was hoping to taxi.
I can drop you.
It's in New Kipasandra. It's right near in our
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's.
a bit out of your way.
I thought it was.
No, not a ship.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I can look at access.
Okay, whatever. Yes.
Yeah, I just don't go that way.
No, I don't want you to taxi.
You don't mean.
Yeah, that's good.
Shall I shut this down?
Yes.